Hello, good evening, everyone. It's really terrific to have a full room at this event. So welcome to Microsoft tonight. My name is Majesty. I work here as EU Government Affairs Manager, focused largely on cybersecurity policy issues. So it's a great pleasure and honor to open up this event. And how many of you have seen the Imitation Game, the movie? So I guess those of you who have seen the movie and who kind of believe in that story may wonder why there's a Polish guy and a French guy introducing an event about the British story. And the reason about that is because the book is about the real story, the untold story about Enigma. So we're really pleased to welcome here Mr. Turing, who will talk to us more about the real story behind Enigma. And I had the pleasure to meet Mr. Turing a couple of months ago in Krakow at the large cybersecurity policy conference. And that was a kind of a highlight to have a person who can put our work on cybersecurity issues in a historical context, together with the families of Polish cryptologists who are involved in breaking Enigma code. And it was particularly interesting for me as a Pole because it's always amazing when you learn an element of history of your own country from a foreigner. And when Mr. Turing was speaking, he mentioned the story of 1920, so still over a decade before Second World War began, when there was a Battle of Warsaw, Poland against the Soviet Union or the Bolsheviks. And we always celebrated that in Poland as a myth of a genius of the Polish chief of state who managed to defend the country against the Bolsheviks. But actually, Mr. Turing made a lot of us realize that the real story behind that battle was that the Polish cryptologists, the same unit that later on took part in breaking Enigma code, has actually broken Russian ciphers and managed to decode the messages so that we actually could run an offensive and win that battle. So it was fantastic to learn a little bit more back then in Krakow, and we're really excited to kick off this event here, and very welcome to both of our great speakers. So.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the French part of this introduction. So yeah, when I read the book, I thought, of course, this is an incredible story, but this is also about European cooperation. And it shows how important, critical was this cooperation at that time with the Polish, with the French, with the British. They're still European, I think. And I think it resonates well today. And I think it shows how European cooperation has managed to end the war and also to build a sustainable peace. And maybe that is something that we don't hear enough today in the political debates, especially in the European elections debates, where we see the rise of populism and Eurosceptical movements. And maybe this book is a good reminder of how important, how critical is this European cooperation. So that's why we're very honored and delighted to have you today. I will shortly introduce you, but I don't think you need an introduction, but I will shortly introduce you, and you will introduce the moderator we have today as well. So you are a successful writer, of course, and among other things, you wrote this book, but also a brilliant biography of your uncle, Alan Turing, of course. And you are a recognized expert on World War II code breaking, and a regular speaker at historical conferences.
And we thought that in the context of cybersecurity being such an important topic for the world today, there'd be no one better than a PhD professor in digital mathematics, somebody who actually works on forensic analysis and understands the context of the work that has happened half a century ago, over half a century ago, for the work we do today. So very well welcome to Ms. Anne Doms, and over to you.
So I was very happy when I got the invite to do this book talk with you, Dermot. And as we said, he's the nephew of Alan, and I thought, well, Alan, of course, everybody knows him, but he needs, or deserves better, a small introduction. And Alan was born in 1912, and he studied at Sherborne School, where he, towards the end of his studies, developed an interest for mathematics. And so he decided to study mathematics, and he got accepted in King's College in Cambridge. And there he got interested in a question posed by David Hilbert, the famous mathematician, actually on one of the building blocks of mathematics. And he was able to solve that question. And actually, the answer was not what most people thought that would be. So that gave a shock in the mathematics world. And he wrote those results in the paper on computable numbers in 1936. Now, at the same time in that paper, he actually also laid the foundation for computer science as we know it today. And his interest in mathematics, he wanted to use that. And then he actually decided to work during the Second World War for Bletchley Park and to work on breaking Enigma, on which we will hear more today. And, well, for those that saw the Imitation Game, he did that using a machine, the bomb. And after the war, he actually still was interested in machines. And he questioned whether machines could be intelligent. And that actually gave the movie the title, The Imitation Game. Because in 1950, he wrote another very, very famous paper on computing machinery and intelligence, in which he introduced that imitation game. And that actually is a thought experiment where you have two rooms. You have a human, and in another room, a human and a computer. And that human that's alone is an interrogator. And he can pose questions to the other room, typed, and then he gets replies back, typed. And the interrogator has to decide whom of the answers belongs to the computer and what comes from the human. And when the computer can mislead the human interrogator, then he passes the Turing test. And this is seen as an intelligence or machine intelligence. And by not only being the father of computer science, he actually then also laid the foundations, in particular for artificial intelligence, what we all encounter today and more in the future. And then, yeah, Alan, unfortunately, 4 years later, had a tragic death. And yeah, actually, his nephew, Dermot, never got to know him, but he followed his footsteps. Just like him, you studied in Sherborne, then you went to King's College in Cambridge, but not in mathematics. You did a PhD in genetics. But then he decided that scientific research, I'm not saying research because he's a researcher, was not his thing, and he went into a legal profession.
Very polite. Yeah.
And well, your specialty was financial regulation. But then in 2012, actually 100 years after the birth of Alan, he got to be a trustee of Bletchley Park, and then started to more or less devote his life to his uncle's work, but then also broader than that. And by now, he already has written, 6 books, ranging from machines, intelligent machines, over Bletchley Park, over the work and life of Alan, and everything surrounded.
And my most famous book, Clearing and Settlement in Europe. But this is people don't ask me to sign that one for them.
Did you bring it?
No, it's heavy. I mean, it takes two people to carry it.
Well, I actually already got the fantastic opportunity to interview Dermot already 3 years ago for a TV documentary made by the Flemish national broadcast on Alan Turing. And then, yeah, who was better to interview than Dermot?
It's a great show, actually.
Yeah,
She did a great job. So,
Thanks. Well, I think it's time now to see what we learned in the imitation game, that Alan, he broke Enigma, he created a machine, but in how far was this his own accomplishment, or did he receive help? So tell us all about your newest book.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm glad we started with the imitation game, because Okay, more than half of you have seen the movie, so you will know, because the movies tell us the facts, and what the historians write is fake news these days. So the facts are that Alan Turing broke the Enigma code single-handedly at Bletchley Park. He invented a computer called Christopher to do that, and it took him until 10 minutes before the American soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy. But fortunately, he got there just in time, and so thousands of American lives were saved. Some of these facts may not be actually true. Broadly, though, I mean, the imitation. We can talk about this in more detail. But broadly, the imitation game gets the themes right, but the details have been made more sexy to make it a better Hollywood movie. And you know, if you like movies, it's a great movie. It's a very good movie. It's very well made. Its script won an Oscar. It's very well acted. But you should not really treat movies as being a substitute for history. So what I wanted to begin with, I mean, we have got Alan Turing. He did invent this machine called the bomb, and he did do it at Bletchley Park. But I've shown you a picture of a Bletchley Park building you may not recognize. This is the stable yard building which Alan Turing was working in 1939. And he moved out of this building very soon because his work on the bomb had been largely done by Christmas of 1939, so not 5 minutes before D-Day, but very, very early in the war, after the Battle of Poland, but before in Western Europe there was a fighting war. There was no fighting war in Western Europe until the spring of 1940, so the work had been done before the war began, at least the fighting war began. So, this is all very strange. So, what is the truth? The truth is even more strange, because this piece of paper that I've put up on the screen is a note by one of the Bletchley Park codebreakers, a chap called John Tiltman. It was written in 1938, and it explains that the British were confused about the Enigma machine. And if you can read it, it says that there's an attachment on the front of the machine that does not appear on the commercial model, and we don't really understand what it is. This is just one of a list of questions that the British codebreakers, who were not yet at Bletchley Park, but the British codebreakers had. If you didn't know what the wiring in the Enigma machine was, and that was on their list of questions, how could they possibly go about developing code-breaking techniques? You know, if you don't know how the physical device works, how can you start working out what the settings are? Because code-breaking, there's two problems. You need to understand the hardware, which the British were struggling with. But then when you've solved the hardware problem, you need to know what software the Germans are using. And you'll say, well, how does an Enigma machine, which is an electromechanical device, what does he mean by software? There are 150 million ways that the machine can be set up to send a message. And the Germans were changing that on every network every day. So every day, on every network, you have to figure out which of those 150 million settings that the Germans are using if you want to try and turn gobbledygook that you have intercepted as a wireless message back into badly spelt German. Okay, so they hadn't even solved the hardware problem, and they were not in any way equipped to tackle the software problem in 1938. And although that memo was written in 1938, the state of knowledge, or lack of knowledge to be more accurate, had not changed by July of 1939. Now, 5 minutes ago, I told you that Alan Turing had basically solved his bomb, which is a software problem solution. He had done that by Christmas of the same year. So how have they gone from 0 to this incredible war-winning weapon, which mysteriously is called the bomb? How have they managed to do that quite so quickly? What has changed? That's at the heart of this XYZ story. I'm going to take the clock back now. I want to go back to 1930, when Hans Thilo Schmidt, who is a rather strange guy, he's the one on the left-hand side of the slide. He is an Iron Cross wearing, decorated war hero from World War I. He fought in the trenches, as did his brother, and after the end of World War I, things did not go too well in Germany for all sorts of reasons that you don't need reminding about. And Hans Thilo Schmidt had a very not very highly paid job, and with his Iron Cross he felt that he deserved more status. Fortunately, his brother had a much a rather good job in the remnants of the German army and got his brother into the Cipher Bureau. So this gave Hans Thilo Schmidt access to the safe in which the secret documents were kept, and Hans Thilo Schmidt, who was a clever guy, realized that he could make the money that he needed by using his access to the safe. So one day he walks into the French embassy in Berlin and asks if he can speak to the military attaché. The military attaché is actually quite used to having German would-be spies walk in and ask to see him. Apparently there was like a stream of these guys, but Hans Thilo Schmidt turned out to be the real deal, and the French had a vetting system which involves another character who you can read about in my book. He's probably the most colourful character of the lot. Haven't got time to talk about him today, but through him he's introduced to the head of one of the French military's code-breaking organisations. They have more than one, and this is Captain Gustave Bertrand, who's the guy in the middle here. Bertrand is sent off to Verviers, and so they travel from France to Belgium, and the Schmidt travels to Verviers from Berlin. Schmidt has in his briefcase documents that he has lifted out of the safe. Bertrand is sent off with a camera to the bathroom in the hotel, while Schmidt and the French spy master sit in the bar and they drink brandy and they smoke cigars, and there's poor Bertrand sitting in the bathroom. He has to do it in the bathroom because there's no natural light in the bathroom, so you can get the photographs to be just right. So you have here one of the photographs that Bertrand took of the Enigma machine, because one of the documents that Schmidt had brought was the operating instructions for the German military Enigma machine. So, we've solved the problem. Well, no, we haven't, because Bertrand takes the photographs back to his colleagues, and they say, well, these are completely useless. You've wasted your time, and lots of our money, by the way. These documents are useless because they are operating instructions. We need wiring diagrams. Without wiring diagrams, the whole hardware problem is unsolvable. Bertrand is not defeated by this because he knows that the Brits are clever guys, and so he gets in touch with his opposite number over in England, and the people in England say, well, thank you very much for these. It's very, very kind of you to offer us these documents, but I'm afraid they're completely useless because without the wiring diagrams, you can't begin to make headway on this problem of the Enigma machine. Bertrand, if nothing else, is an obstinate and persistent kind of a guy, and he has been instructed as part of the Franco-Polish military alliance, which was put in place after World War I, to make contact at the Cipher Bureau level with Polish military intelligence. And so he gets on the train and he goes to Warsaw to meet Guido Langer, who's the head of the Cipher Bureau in Warsaw, and he's expecting to get the same answer from Langer as he's had from his own people and from the Brits. And Langer says, no, this is fantastic, this is just what we've been waiting for, and we're going to put our mathematicians onto it and we'll get back to you when we've solved the problem. This is great. There's only one thing that didn't happen according to Langer's prediction, which is that the bit about getting back in touch with you when we have solved the problem, that bit perhaps took a little bit longer, But okay, so indeed, Langer puts his mathematicians onto it, and there's a story behind how the Polish Cipher Bureau happens to have mathematicians lying around waiting to solve the Enigma, which you may think that's a joke. They actually had mathematicians. They had hired 3 mathematicians, mathematics graduates of Poznan University, and they put them on a code-breaking course specifically to deal with the problem of Enigma as soon as they started picking up Enigma enciphered radio traffic in 1926. So they picked these graduates, 3 of them on this slide, Marian Rejewski on the left, Henryk Zygalski and Jerzy Ruzicki in the top right-hand corner. They started with Rejewski. He was slightly older than the other 2, and they put him in a darkened room. There's something about code breaking and darkened rooms. So they put Rejewski in a room with no natural light. Obviously good working conditions for mathematicians. But Rejewski was quite astonishing because he had been taught permutation theory at university, and he realized that the problem with the Enigma machine could be reduced to equations. And they're not like normal equations, where if you multiply both sides by 2 and then you divide both sides by 2, you end up where you started. If you do that with permutations, it doesn't work. But he knew how to manipulate permutation equations, and you can see some of his equations are actually on this slide. Now, if you speak Polish and you speak mathematics, then you'll be able to figure out what this is. But I suspect that many people in this room might not do both those languages, and I don't do either of them, so I'm not going to. But Anne, you may want to have a go at this. Anyway, so Rejewski in later life actually explained how he had done it, which is just one of those. I mean, I think it's one of the top 3 code-breaking achievements of the 20th century, because what he did through pure mathematics. So he had a commercial Enigma machine which didn't have the plug board and all the problems that the British didn't understand. He had this old machine, it wasn't any use. He had the stolen operating instructions, and he had a pile of intercepted messages. And with only these 3 bits of information, he was able to reconstruct the wiring in the Enigma machine through pure mathematical analysis. It's just one of these amazing achievements. If you want to ask me what the other 2 are, we can do that in the Q&A. So this meant that the Poles were then able to go off, and there's another guy who never gets a look in on the story of Polish code breaking. His name's Antony Palut. He's a code breaker. He's in the Polish military. He's a spy, but above all those things, he is actually an electrical engineer. He's a radio engineer, to be more precise. And so what he's able to do is to create for the Polish military intelligence fake Enigma machines. These are functional equivalent Enigma machines. They don't look like Enigma machines, but they work like Enigma machines because he's recreated these machines from Rejewski's equations. Quite astonishing. They've solved the hardware problem, and they have done that by 1932. Now, Hitler comes to power in 1933, and as the temperature goes up a bit, they need to start solving the messages, not just working out what the machine is. They need to solve the software problem as well. So they spend the next few years trying to keep up with the Germans on the software problem. Fortunately, although the Germans changed the operating method for the Enigma pretty much once a year, the Poles, because they're ahead of the game so early, have managed to keep pace with the German changes. So by 1937-38, they've invented this thing which is it's an electromechanical solution to finding out the settings that the Germans were using. Which of the 150 million settings are the Germans using? And we can do this. It takes 1 minute to explain this. This machine, the Bomber, it takes about 20 minutes to explain why it's called the Bomber. So we'll just do how it works. That's 1 minute. It goes through, so you've got 3 rotors on your Enigma machine, 26 positions for each rotor. 26 cubed is 17,576. What they've got is they've got the machine to crank through the 17,000 possible starting positions, and it does that. This machine would do that in about 20 minutes to half an hour. The Turing bomb does exactly the same thing, and it does it in about 10 minutes. But and it's a more sophisticated. You can see this one's only got 6 banks of rotors on it, and Turing's one's got 30 something. So you know, it's a more sophisticated machine. It's the same principle, though. You go through all the possible rotor settings as fast as you can, and then you stop when you think you found a plausible one. So it's kind of okay. We're getting to it. But I haven't mentioned the Brits yet. The Brits faded in 1931 when they said we couldn't get anywhere without wiring diagrams. The Brits wake up in 1938. They discover there's this guy called Adolf Hitler who seems to be eating up Europe. And so they begin very slowly to feel their way towards military intelligence sharing, in particular with the French. And this very tentative move towards cooperation extends into the code breaking area, and you've seen that there's that memo that I showed you earlier in the presentation with these questions, which was questions for the French about how the Enigma machine is working. So there is a beginning of a sort of cross-channel exchange of at least questions. Now, Bertrand, meanwhile, has been in constant contact with Guido Langer in Warsaw, and Guido Langer keeps saying, yeah, these problems are very, very difficult, and we know how difficult they are. He's not telling the French what the answers are. He's just saying, yes, we understand these problems. They're very, very hard. Bertrand, who is no fool, decides that the sensible thing to do is to get the Polish codebreakers and the British codebreakers into the same room. And so he calls a conference which takes place in January 1939 to exchange know-how on the Enigma problem. Because everybody says they know what the problems are, but they're not really getting very far on what the answers are. The conference is okay. I mean, everybody sort of has a nice dinner and they get to know each other a bit, but there's no real exchange of ideas. The British, who have been working on Enigma problems in the Spanish Civil War, have made some progress, but it was on an old commercial type machine, not the German Army and Air Force machine with the different wiring and this funny plugboard thing on the front. 2 good things come out of this meeting. One is that the French decide to formalize the know-how sharing partnership in the form of the X, Y, and Z alliance. And you can see this document here, which is secret document number 211 in the French series. It says, note for Y. What's this? So this is the copy in the British National Archives. There was also a note for Z as well, but and then to translate badly from the French, it says, for greater convenience and security, from now on we propose to use the following code letters for each of us. X is Paris, Y is London, and Z is Warsaw. And so now you understand why the countries are in that order, and so it has been suggested that the Poles should have been first because they were first with the Enigma solution. But unfortunately, the French set the code name, so I can't change them. That's 78 years on. I'm afraid I'm not in a position to change the code name. So so that's why we have the code name. So that's number 1 outcome. Number 2 outcome is that it was agreed that if anybody made any progress on the Enigma problem, they'd send a coded message to the other 2 countries, which would say, something has come up, or in French, il y a du nouveau. And, well, we all know what the geopolitical situation in Europe was in the spring and early summer of 1939. So it got to the point where, partly because of that, and partly because the Poles at last were stuck on the Enigma problem, and we can, if you want, we can ask a question about how that was later, but they were stuck on the Enigma problem for the first time, and they needed some help, and particularly they needed the British to help because they were stuck with not having enough engineering capacity to make enough bombers, and they thought the Brits could help them out with this problem. So they sent a message, il y a du nouveau. And they called another 3-country conference which took place in Warsaw in the 3rd week of July 1939. And at this conference, despite the best efforts of Dilly Knox, who was the British #1 codebreaker, he's the one on the bottom of the slide, who had a temper tantrum halfway through the conference, which was not helpful. He was calmed down by his boss, Alistair Denniston, the future head of Bletchley Park, who's the man at the top of the slide. The Poles revealed everything they knew about Enigma. So Denniston went back to London with, in his pocket, a list of the pieces of information that the Poles had shared, which is the document on the right. Anybody who's sitting in the front row can see that that's in German. Why is this list in German? Well, let me tell you that some things in Europe do not change. The British spoke no Polish. The French spoke no Polish. The French spoke no English. That has changed. The Poles spoke a little bit of French, but no English. That has changed. The British spoke fluent French. So Denniston spoke perfect French, and Knox spoke French a bit better than I do, so that was good. So they could speak some French. So the Brits and the French could communicate in French. Well, the Poles couldn't really do that. So actually, but the only language that everybody spoke competent German, because they were the common enemy. They were reading the German messages, or they wanted to. And so the conference took place in German, and that's why all the notes that go in the XYZ intelligence sharing triangle, all the notes that go from one country to the other are all in German. So Denniston comes back to London in the third week of July 1939 with all this information, and if you can read it, then you can see number 15 is die Bomben. So they've come back with the know-how about how the bomber works and enable the British to get to work on their own version of the bomber. So this is why Alan Turing, he immediately sits down with Dilly Knox and has started to design the British bomb effectively before hostilities begin. Amazing. Okay, so I've now answered the question I set out to answer, but then this sets off another bunch of questions in my own mind about, well, what happened to these Polish codebreakers when the war broke out? So, in fact, my book is not really about Enigma machines and wiring and Rejewski's equations, so I'm sorry to disappoint the mathematicians amongst you. It's all in Appendix 1, and it's probably wrong, and Professor Dumps will tell you what the mistakes that I made. But because I actually found that the stories of the people turned out to be really, really quite fascinating. So this is the very, very abbreviated version in like 3 slides. So after the war broke out, the Polish codebreakers escaped from Poland, and there's a whole load of drama around that, which is very, very interesting. And they found themselves working for our old friend Gustave Bertrand, just outside Paris. And so the XYZ intelligence triangle is continuing right up until the point where Germany invades France in 1940. They're breaking Enigma together. There's a teleprinter link between the Chateau de Vignoles, where the Poles and the French were, and Bletchley Park. So they're actually able to exchange Enigma settings as they find them. As we know, Germany invaded France in the spring of 1940, and once again the Poles had to escape. And this is where the plot gets really very difficult to believe, but you couldn't put this in the Imitation Game. Nobody would actually believe this. The Poles end up working once again for Gustave Bertrand, who now is being paid by the Vichy government to operate a secret code-breaking operation, which it's supposed to be looking at British codes, but actually Poland was never very enthusiastic about spying on the Brits. So they're still spying on the Germans from the secret headquarters they had at the place called the Chateau des Fous, which is down in the unoccupied part of France. It's in that rather attractive area, tourist region, where the Pont du Gard and the Palais des Papes, at Avignon, and Nîmes, and all the Roman ruins and all that kind of. I mean, it's it's a lovely place. So they are. They're drinking wine and they're at this place, and as well as drinking wine, they're playing football and they're playing. To my mind, this picture bottom right is a game that in Britain we call croquet. This photograph is actually captioned criquet, which I understand was the word that the Poles put on it, and somehow there's still a cultural divide between Britain and Poland. We Brits will have to try and explain to the Poles that cricket and croquet are not quite the same game. They both involve balls and sort of things you hit, but never mind that. So, anyway, they're having outings on bicycles to Avignon, and these two in the middle at the bottom are doing things that human beings all over the world do, and we don't like to talk about that because it's not polite. These photographs are about 1942. By the end of 1942, with the Americans in the war, the Germans have decided that on the slightest excuse they're going to occupy the unoccupied part of France and take that over as part of their military occupation of the country. And at the same time, they have uncovered information from Warsaw, which implies that a team of Polish codebreakers had broken Enigma before the outbreak of World War II. And so they send round, in northern France, they send round these wanted lists, this Fahndungsnachweis. And in this wanted list are the names of the Polish codebreakers, and then there are information sheets that accompany the wanted list, and the information sheets have got mugshots of the Polish codebreakers. My guys that I showed you on the previous slide, they're actually on the wanted list. Fortunately, those of you with sharp eyes will see this wanted list is dated the 1st of March 1943, by which time some of the Polish codebreakers managed to escape from France. These guys are on the run for the whole of World War II. So, this is my final slide, which is the fates of some of them. Guido Lange, you can see on the extreme left-hand side. You may remember the photograph I showed you of him earlier. He's sort of like a big sort of guy, fond of his food. This is what he looks like after 2 years in German prison camp, having been interrogated by the Gestapo on what he knew about Enigma code-breaking pre-World War II. With him is Maximilian Czarski, his deputy, and they managed to keep the secret, these two, even though they were interrogated. My nautical scene is a surviving photograph of a shipwreck that took place in January 1942. Jerzy Różycki was travelling from North Africa, French North Africa, to the Chateau des Fous in France, and his ship was shipwrecked. It was not torpedoed, so it was just a regular shipwreck, but nevertheless, it was a shipwreck, and he did not survive. Anthony Palut, top right-hand corner, he's the engineer that built the bomber, built the fake Enigma machines, and did a whole load more. He was captured by the Germans and sent to Sachsenhausen. He died in Sachsenhausen the week before the war in Europe ended, because the Allies decided that they needed to drop bombs on the Heinkel factory, which the slave workers, including Palut, were working on to make German aircraft. Palut, being a bilingual German speaker and a qualified engineer, had managed to get himself into a position of trust in the Heinkel factory. So he had responsibility for quality control on the wings of the Heinkel aircraft that were being made. Palut would not sign off a wing as being suitable for use until it contained at least 3 fatal defects. It's a shame that he did not survive the war, but I don't know why the Allies decided to bomb the factory in the last week of April, but that's how things are. The three photographs at the bottom are slightly better news stories. I've got 2 codebreakers I haven't introduced you to so far. These are Kazimierz Gatza and Henryk Paszkowski. These two were working in France. Paszkowski survived the shipwreck, And these two guys, you can see they look quite happy. Paszkowski was the one who was cuddling his girlfriend on the bench as well. So he's a thoroughly good guy. He actually married her, so we get a respectability point for that. These two went to work for Bertrand after World War II. They worked for French military intelligence as codebreakers, rather than going back to Poland. So that's quite interesting. In the middle, we've got Marian Rejewski reading a book. This is one of the things that Rejewski was good at. He's not the party guy like some of the others are, but he did an amazing thing. He went back to Poland. He's one of the he's probably not the only one, but out of maybe a dozen Polish codebreakers who made it to Britain in 1943, I think he might be the only one who went back to Poland after World War II, and it was extremely dangerous then. And the fact that he decided to take the personal risk that involved was quite amazing. So he may not be your sort of Rambo character, machine gun toting sort of military guy. He's a mathematician, but he got some inner strength which the others didn't have. The film star on the bottom right-hand side, doesn't he? I mean, he just looks like something out of an Italian movie from about 1964, doesn't it? This is Henryk Zygalski, who became a mathematics professor in Britain, and he settled in Britain. And the reason he stayed rather than going back to Poland with his friend Rejewski was that he'd fallen in love, which is a very nice way to bring this presentation to an end, I think. So there we are.
Well, thank you very much for the nice and also teasing introduction, because it's clear there's a lot more going on. And despite your cryptic title that indeed suggests that you're also going to describe all the technical details, it's more a story about humans. And it reads like a thriller. I have to admit I couldn't put it down, so I read through the whole night. So be aware. But I was constantly wondering, where did you get all that information and then all those pictures? Where did you travel to?
Okay, well, there's 5 questions in there, but let's start with the pictures. The pictures were really, really important because when you read about code breaking, it tends to be stories about technical achievements. And I thought at one stage this book was going to be about that. But I met Henryk Zygalski's niece, Anna Zygalska-Cannon, who lives in the UK. She used to work for the BBC in the days of communism. She used to intercept radio broadcasts coming from communist Poland, and part of the British intelligence gathering was to listen to Polish radio broadcasts and produce digests of what the communists are thinking. So she had this job in Britain. But in her collection of stuff are about 250 photographs of what the codebreakers were doing during the period that they were in France and in North Africa and later in the UK. And outside in the reception area, there's a screen where you can see they're going round around. Some of them are less polite than the ones that so there's drinking scenes and other things that you can't show to under 18 audience. But these photographs are really, really important because they made these people turn into 3-dimensional characters. They're doing things that people do, and as I said, I sort of got intrigued about what happened to them. But it was these pictures in particular that brought them to life. But part of your question was also about where does the sort of information come from, and that's very strange as well. I mean, one of the odd things about war records is they end up in funny countries. So the Polish records are in London because they came with the Polish government in exile. And then the exiled Polish servicemen gradually gave over to two Polish institutes in London the collections of personal documents they had. So these collections are quite large now. The British and the Americans captured all the German documents as they occupied Germany in 1944, 1945, and took them all back to Britain, photographed them all, gave them back to Germany in the 1950s and the 1980s, but that means that you can go to see them in Germany, but some of them actually, the copies of them are in the National Archives in the UK and copies in the National Archives in the US. So oddly, to go and look at German documents, I quite often find it's more convenient to do it in Washington than it is in Freiburg. The French documents were captured by the Germans in 1940, and then the Russians captured Berlin in 1945 and took all the stuff they found in Berlin back to Moscow. So the French documents were released by the Russians under Boris Yeltsin's government back to France. So some of this stuff, I mean, you know, some of the Polish documents, the Polish telegrams, for example, don't exist in the Polish records, but they exist in the German records because the German codebreakers had intercepted the Polish telegrams, they decoded them and translated them into German. And these are amongst the documents that the British dragged out of a lake in South Germany in 1945 and took them back to London and gave them back to the Germans in 1983 or something. And so you can go to Berlin to look at the Polish telegrams that happen to be in German. I mean, you know, so everything is like in the wrong place. I mean, really, everything is in the wrong place.
You had to decrypt. You had to decrypt yourself.
Yeah.
In order to bring everything together. And what did you strike most in the whole story?
One thing that I hadn't expected to find was the role of the old-fashioned spies in this. So I told you about Bertrand with his camera in the bathroom, which is great, but then there's this guy called Rex, who he's a retired ex-convict. He's been a gambler. What he used to do, he'd fasten on young men in casinos in the Côte d'Azur and other parts of, you know, well-moneyed Europe, and he'd sort of fix them with his eyes, and he'd offer them a cigar and a nice glass of something expensive, and when he got them to the card tables, he would arrange, because he was very good at this, to relieve these young men of all their money. That's how he made his living, as a card fraudster. And so he did time in French prison, German prison, British prison for this. He was banned from all these casinos. And when it was time for him to retire, he'd made a lot of money doing this. He did all sorts of things. He tried to start a civil war in Spain in about 1920. And then the French decided that he was too good an asset to be allowed to be operating in private practice anymore. So they hired him for French intelligence to basically buy and sell. He was trafficking in passports and code books. And I mean, this is old-fashioned early 20th century spying. It's fantastic. So Rex is a brilliant character. And then I got Biffy Dunderdale, who we believe, because he was a good friend of Ian Fleming's, and we think that Biffy Dunderdale is probably the model for James Bond, but it doesn't kind of work, does it? We say the name's Dunderdale, Biffy Dunderdale. It doesn't. So I think Fleming had to change things a little bit to get. But Biffy Dunderdale, he's am I allowed to go back? I probably, yeah. So Biffy is the Y guy in the middle here. So there's I've got Bertrand, Biffy, and Rievsky. So yeah. So these I mean, you know, I hadn't expected in a book about Enigma machines to have all these colourful sort of dead letter boxes and, you know, all this good old Le Carré kind of stuff. It's all there. It's great.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And what about the mathematics? How important is the mathematics still in the story?
Well, I think it all comes back to what Rejewski did, deprived of daylight, but how he was able to see the Enigma machine as something that you could model in these permutation equations, and then work out how to solve the equations. I mean, this is just the most astonishing thing. You can see how. I mean, it's quite easy for a non-mathematician like me to see how the equations are put together. But then to see how to solve them when you can't multiply both sides by 2 and end up, and divide by 2 and then end up with what you started. The way I describe it in the book is, it's like if you make an omelette out of eggs. You can. It's a one-way process. You can't then take the omelette and then stick it back into the shell and start back where you finished. And that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to unscramble the eggs. And so, yeah, I think it's an amazing achievement. So the mathematics is at the center of the story, but I'm afraid it's not an algebra book. I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Yeah, but the appendix is already explaining a lot, and it's amazing how they went to create those Zygalski sheets that you describe, and then from there to the machines. It's wonderful. Well, I think now it's time to let the audience ask some questions. So we have a microphone in the room. So who wants to start up? Okay.
Thank you. Fascinating story. Looking forward to read the book. One question. You mentioned about the fact that the Abwehr, the German intelligence, had actually started to have indications that someone was reading the Enigma. In the meanwhile, they had occupied 2 countries and captured all their files. How come they had never gotten to the stage that they had definitive, absolute proof that Enigma was not as safe as they thought it was, and as a result of that, they needed to change completely their encryption system and not just keep adding keys, which was really what they were doing?
The answer to your question is actually in what you've already said. So, which sounds a bit strange, but first of all, the Poles did try to destroy all their records. The only thing is that bureaucracy got the better of them. So the Cipher Bureau diligently destroyed all their documents, but military protocol requires that you have to send a copy of your documents to head office for filing, and head office had carefully filed them and not destroyed their files. So what happened was the Germans actually acquired a vast amount of documentation, not just cipher material, but vast amounts of documentation, and it took them a long time to go through it. So I'm not surprised that it took them a while, but what they did, bearing in mind that what they had only went up to the summer of 1939, by which time the Poles were actually stuck. What happened was that the Germans knew that the Enigma machine had been insecure, and so they had brought about changes, and this was where, what's that psychological thing where you want to believe your own story? Yes, that's it. The confirmation bias comes into it. So the German interrogators who were sent to interrogate Langer and Chansky in 1944, there was a Gestapo guy who knew nothing about codes, and there were 2 guys from the German code-breaking agency who had recommended that the system was insecure in 1938 and had said, we've got to change this, and it had taken them 12 months to get their ideas accepted by the German military, but they had eventually been accepted. And Langer and Chansky's answer was, you're absolutely right, we did break the Enigma up to the point where we were forced out of Poland, but you bastards, you changed the system, and so from then on, what were we supposed to do? And so it was absolutely perfect because it fitted the story that the Germans wanted to hear absolutely perfectly. So that's how they, but still, how they were clever enough to do that at the time, I really, really don't know. But that's how the secret remained a secret. Well, the French records, I suspect because the French had failed to break Enigma up at least until the point the XYZ triangle was working in early 1940. There probably wasn't a great deal. And Bertrand had sworn to the British that he would ensure that the secret never got into German hands when the Battle of France began. And I think the way he did that was partly by destroying records and partly by keeping the documents with himself personally. So his own personal archive, which I didn't mention a minute ago, but his own personal archive he kept with himself, and he hid it in his mother's apartment after the invasion of France by the Germans, so the second invasion of France by the Germans. So that stuff was declassified and released by the French Ministry of Defense so that you can actually view it, and that was released for the first time 3 years ago. So I was one of the first people to be allowed to see Bertrand's own archive of documents which cover the period from 1930 up to about 1942. So you know, this is great stuff. So.
More questions? Yeah.
Now, yeah, I'm going to take the privilege to ask you a question as well. And it was fascinating to hear about the role of technology in all this story. You mentioned that the Poles really couldn't get where they wanted to get because they didn't have the engineering capacity. And in a way, that's something what we observe today in cybersecurity, that actually it's a technology that protects information, but also the bad guys use the same technology to help to break in. You know, we may use behavioral analytics to help to track the bad behavior. The bad guys are using the same tools, the AI, to help us trick it. So my question is, had there been no cooperation and had the Poles didn't have access to technology, to the engineering capacity, do you see that there was another possible ending to the story and the kind of software layer or mathematics track would allow to solve Enigma, or that was simply not feasible?
No, I think you have a very good point here, which is that the Poles are obviously ahead of the game by hiring mathematicians to join the Cipher Bureau in the late 1920s, and that means they were 10 years ahead of the Brits and the Americans, who didn't think that mathematicians had a role to play. But the connection comes when they realize that machine ciphers are going to need a different approach to things. And so there's a reason why Alan Turing was hired in 1938 to be put on the reserve list of emergency staff to be called up to do code breaking if hostilities broke out. So they'd obviously had this idea in Britain by 1938. Okay, it's 10 years after the Poles got there, but that's still fine. So I think there was clearly a recognition that you needed something to add to the linguists. I think the linguists still had a very important role, because even Alan Turing's bomb machine depends on being able to guess at what the plain text of the message is, and then you test the plain text to see if there's a position of all three rotors and a position of the plug board as well, which could turn that piece of plain text into the intercepted Enigma encrypted wireless message that you found. So it's testing the message at multiple places. The Polish bomber worked on a slightly different model, but so you still need linguists to help you with the problem. And I guess to some extent that involves mathematical skills in the sense that it's a problem in mathematical logic, which is why you've got somebody like Alan Turing, who's a mathematical logician, rather than other branches of mathematics. But yeah, so to get to the answer to your question, my belief is that because they'd got mathematicians at Bletchley Park, they would probably have found some way of doing it. When Alan Turing was told how Rejewski had solved the problem, he said, "Oh, of course, that's obvious now you think about it." Yeah, I mean, it's like when you told the answer, of course, it's like, wish I thought of that myself. So I think they would probably have got there, but the question is with how much delay and whether that would have had an impact on the outcome of the war. And when you think that Britain was hanging on by just a little tiny hair in the autumn of 1940, it needed every help it could get. And if it hadn't had the help of Enigma code breaking in the autumn of 1940, Britain might have been knocked out of the war, and then the future of Europe might have looked very different. It's quite scary, really, but...
Yes, one more question.
Hello. So I just have more like a personal question about the book. Like normally when I think about mathematicians or engineers, we always think about nerdy people, shy. But so I was thinking, who was then keeping the team together? Like, was it from the mathematician team, or was it somebody from the military, somebody else? What do you think? Who do you think was the person keeping all the team working together, even despite the hardships they found?
One thing you may have spotted, maybe I can't go backwards, maybe, oh, yes we can, good, thank you. You may have spotted these guys are all men, these guys are all men, these guys, oh no, they're not quite all men. I had a struggle to find some female characters. 1930s and 1940s were not good years for gender equality. But we do have some women. So Paszkowska, the girl in the two bottom photographs, female codebreaker, hired by the Poles to do deciphering work. I mean, you've got to have your girlfriend around, you might as well put her to work, is kind of the philosophy there. But to answer your question, the lady in the top left-hand corner of this slide, this is Marie Bertrand. This is Gustave Bertrand's wife. She won medals in World War II because, as well as being Gustave Bertrand's wife and also being in charge of the arrangements at the Château des Fous, where the Polish codebreakers were working in secret for 2 years, she also turns out to have been an intelligence agent working for the French resistance and under British control in the last year and a half of the war. She's a very impressive character in her own right, but I think she is the answer to your question about how you keep the nerds and the football players and the military from killing each other, because this is a mix of people who might not. There's another problem going on here. There's a political problem going on here. Amongst this group of Polish and French codebreakers at the Château des Fous, there's a team of Spanish. We forget about Spain in World War II, but it's very important. For the first half of the war, the Allies were terrified that Franco would bring nationalist Spain in on the same side as fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And there was a small group of Republican Spanish who had fled Spain and joined Bertrand's team, and so they were code-breaking Spanish messages in the same place as these guys. Now, we have the aristocratic Polish team leaders. So this is Langer, Chansky, Palut, who were the senior members of the Polish team. These were sort of conservatively minded folks who could not stand the socialist Republican Spanish. So in the team photographs where you've got the Spanish and the Polish in the same photograph, that Rievsky, Zygalski, and Ruzhitsky, who got on well with the Spanish guys, are in one corner with the Spanish, and then there's the aristocratic Poles at the other end. So this is not an easy problem. The social dynamics were quite hard. So the Bertrands, and particularly Marie Bertrand, who was respected by everybody. She's very charming, but she's also no nonsense, and she was keeping this team going. She's very impressive. Learnt much more about her after finishing my book than I knew while I was writing it. So I wasn't able to give her as much credibility as she needs. But so we do have some women characters. Look, while I'm on the girls, let's do the lady in the pot. Why is there a lady in a pot? The lady in the pot. She was Bertrand's chauffeur's daughter, and she's about 14 when that photograph was taken. But she fell in love with the youngest Polish codebreaker, the guy who's sitting on a pot in the photograph at the bottom here, Kazimierz Gatza. And after World War II, she told him that she'd loved him all these years, and they got married. And so, there's another happy ending to this story. So I can't call a 14-year-old girl with a pet rabbit a codebreaker, but she's an important character in the story.
Well, I know that there's more questions, but do we have time for one more? Okay, one last question.
Our clock here says
Thank
you have
you.
24
Yes,
seconds
yes.
to go. So
Can I
And you
ask
still
you to
need to
be
answer.
a bit more specific about how breaking the German code so that allies could read them could have helped the allies? You whetted my appetite by saying at the end of 1940, Britain could, the fate of Britain could have been quite different from what it was by reading the code. Can you be a bit more specific about and give us more other examples?
yes, so this may turn into a very long catalogue. So, and when I get boring, you will wave your arms and tell me to stop. But so let's. Okay, so the time is up. It's already said time is up. It's too late. Okay. 1940, when the British started to decipher Enigma messages on a large enough scale to make them useful to the military commanders, they were able to determine where the German bombers were targeting British cities and British factories by deciphering Enigma messages, which would point to it was actually a direction finding system that they broke, so that they were able to work out where the Germans were going to point their direction radio beams, and then they could jam the radio beams to stop the bombers finding their targets. So that was really important in the late summer, autumn of 1940. Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe Enigma code was being read by the British, and so the British had a much better understanding of the German Air Force order of battle than they would have had from other sources. So this meant that Air Chief Marshal Dowding was able to commit the last fighter squadrons to the battle, which is, any military person will tell you it's completely insane to commit your last line of reserves when everybody else is fighting. You need to keep something back for tomorrow. He was able to take that very difficult decision to send the last squadron up because he knew that actually it was safe to do so. So again, that was, well, safe is not the right word, but at least not militarily irresponsible to do so. So that's 1940. The Battle of the Atlantic, where Britain's supplies were coming over in convoys from America, and the U-boats knew exactly where the convoys were, because the Germans, we forget the German codebreakers. German codebreakers were cracking good at their job too. The German codebreakers had broken the convoy code, so they knew exactly, the U-boats knew exactly where the convoys were. What was crucially important was for the convoys to be told where the U-boats were. So there was this game of cat and mouse going on in the Atlantic. By 1943, the code-breaking war had been won by the Allies because they were able to read U-boat Enigma by this stage and were able to route the convoys away from the U-boat packs. And by that stage, the British eventually had got round to changing the naval codes. How did they know to change the naval codes? Because they read in Enigma messages that the Germans were, okay. So there's another example. And then in the land war, I mean, there's thousands of examples I could give, but in the turning point battle in North Africa, when for British historians, this is all very well-known story, but when Field Marshal Rommel was, he had 2 years of amazing success against the British in North Africa, but eventually the tide turned, and the British general Bernard Montgomery personally took all the credit for it, but actually the reason that he was able to win was that he had been given perfect intelligence from Enigma decrypts about what Rommel's strength was, and in particular what Rommel's weaknesses were, and he knew that Rommel was completely out of tank fuel. And that crucial piece of intelligence meant that Monty was able to launch his attack, knowing that again, it's all about having confidence to know that what might or might not succeed will succeed. And so Monty, of course, now is heavily criticised for, if he knew that Rommel had no tank fuel, why didn't he follow up his success at El Alamein and completely destroy the German army in North Africa? And so, you know, but there are hundreds of other examples I could give you about the land war, but going right up until the end of the war. So, you know, there are many examples where the Enigma decrypt in particular made a change to the at least to the decision making taken by commanders in the field. Let's not forget that wars are not fought by mathematicians using pencils and squared paper. The wars are nasty, messy things that we must seek to avoid all the time, because they're fought by people who have to put themselves in personal danger. They have to do the most unpleasant, unimaginably nasty things. Those are the people who win battles. Those are the people who lose battles. And I'm always very conscious when you talk about code breaking, it kind of makes it a bit more glamorous than actually it is. It's disgusting. It's just a horrible thing. Code breaking is about helping your side win, and that might or might not be you know, the right thing to do. But you know, that's where we are. That was a really bad note to finish on. I'm very sorry about that. But
well, let's say it is a fascinating story about cryptology, but especially about humans and human collaboration, sharing intelligence, working over disciplines, and especially in mathematics. And we're not all nerds. Well, I'm sure that everybody has still a lot of questions, but we still have the opportunity during the drinks where you will be able to buy the book and where Dermot will sign this by hand. So, well, thank you all for coming and enjoy.